俺はただのサイヤ人だ。サイヤ人だと。
Our look at Bardock now forces us to jump ahead, far beyond the serialization of Dragon Ball, out of the 20th century entirely, to the year 2011. To put things into a little bit of perspective, the Dragon Ball manga had been over for 16 years. Dragon Ball Kai, a re-edited re-airing of the Dragon Ball Z television series, had just been cancelled earlier that year. It would be another 2 years before a new theatrical movie would kickstart a resurgence of brand new Dragon Ball material. Oh, and it was also about 6 months before I started Dragon Ball Dissection. At this point in time, one of the main moneymakers of the franchise was the Japanese arcade game Dragon Ball Heroes. I don't really know anything about it. I think it includes collectible cards, Japanese kids love it. At any rate, Dragon Ball video games have had a long history of indulging in what-if scenarios and introducing new transformations. The Korean-exclusive Dragon Ball Online, which actually did include a Toriyama-assisted storyline, set after the events of Dragon Ball, had already brought Bardock back as a time-traveling menace saved by the game's villain just before the destruction of planet Vegeta. So I suppose it was only a matter of time before someone decided to come along and combine those concepts, and that person was Oishi Naho, a fan artist brought to official status with Dragon Ball SD, a manga retelling of various Dragon Ball moments but with the added twist of the characters being drawn cute and tiny, and that's about it. Although I think maybe it's gotten better in recent years, I don't know, I stopped caring a long time ago. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy her art, but she always ends up being saddled with projects that are less than impressive. Which brings us to today's episode. The powers that be behind Dragon Ball Heroes decided Bardock's new Super Saiyan transformation was so important, it needed a 3-part manga special to tell its story. Not only that, but the manga would then be adapted into an original animation later that year. In an era when there wasn't a lot of new Dragon Ball content, this was clearly a big deal. And so, 21 years after the original Bardock special presented the cathartic ending of Bardock dying with his people, defeated but content, episode of Bardock burst onto the scene to prove that satisfying endings aren't really endings, because nobody frets about grinding good storytelling under the wheels of the franchise as long as money is made and fans are serviced. I should mention it's been a lot longer than I anticipated getting this episode ready after the Bardock special, and yes, you're already saying, it's another cutaway where MistareFusion whines about how busy his life is. We know you suck at getting content up, just get on with it already. But yes, while I have had the usual overtime at work and rehearsal or performances almost every single night, the latter 2 Bardock stories have presented a unique challenge for me simply in being able to get the footage I need to complete it. The Kanzenban scans I have for the main series have been a huge boon to me for years, and in my opinion, keep Dragon Ball Dissection looking more professional than if I was using, say, fan scanlations or mixing multiple sources together. I was forced to use the Viz translation for the few clips I used of Dragon Ball Minus back in the Saiyan arc. Nothing against Viz, but I hated not having the actual source material in Japanese. However, I was under a time crunch and needed it done. So thanks to Maria, Ms. DBZ Babe, and Geekdom 101, I did get scans of the Japanese manga pages for episode of Bardock and Dragon Ball Minus. Thank you so much, you're awesome, and these videos couldn't have been made without you. And because of this process, I had to learn for myself how to clean raw manga scans, which has been a blast, but obviously it took me quite a bit of time because we're talking about over 60 pages of manga here, and episode of Bardock in particular was never printed on very high quality paper to begin with. So I'm sure these results aren't terribly perfect, but I am kind of proud of what I did, and I just had to stop and brag about it for a second. You know, part of me feels like reviewing an episode of Bardock is unfair. While it does function as a standalone story, the only reason it exists is as promotional material. To me, that seems rather akin to that DC Comics children's dictionary where Lex Luthor takes 40 cakes. Are you really supposed to take it seriously, hold it up to the standards of a real comic, place it into the continuity, or just accept it as a piece of fluff designed for a specific purpose, and that specific purpose is not furthering any kind of story? I honestly don't know, because I have no idea how I'm supposed to look at this. As silly as it sounds, is this real? After all, this is not as clearly ignorable as a children's dictionary, but in the introduction Oishi even refers to it as a what-if story. Well, considering the third stop on our look at Bardock is going to complicate matters even further, we're probably never going to know for sure. And then there's the fact that even 40 cakes ended up being popular enough to be referenced in real comics, so it's not as if the ideas of episode of Bardock couldn't come back in something more substantial. But the fact of the matter is, I can't ignore Episode of Bardock because of how fascinating its priorities are shown to be when set alongside its predecessor. Despite the fact that one is presented as a direct follow-up to the other, they really couldn't be more different from each other. They stand in stark contrast to one another because Episode of Bardock does everything the Bardock special doesn't. Whenever one zigs, the other zags, especially in regards to those prequel pitfalls I mentioned in the last part. And that's terrible. Episode of Bardock picks up towards the end of the Bardock special when Bardock is making his ill-fated last stand against Frieza. Only instead of dying in the explosion, as anyone would logically expect, Bardock wakes up on planet Vegeta in the past when it was called Planet Plant and the Saiyans hadn't even yet colonized it. He's nursed back to health by the friendly locals and meets Frieza's ancestor Chilled. They fight, he turns into a Super Saiyan, defeats Chilled, saves the cute little Plantians, and lives happily ever after, and oh my sweet baby Goku, I felt myself getting dumber just summarizing that. Now, clearly I don't care for this, but I'm not sure how much blame to throw at the feet of Oishi. This whole thing seems rather editorially mandated, so I have no idea how much control, if any, she had over the story. The only goal was to make Bardock a Super Saiyan because that's the transformation in the video game this was meant to promote. However, based on her comments I've read in interviews, she comes across as a huge Bardock fan, and I think that's part of the problem. I think fans being promoted to official status can be a good thing. They care about the material, they have a keen attention to detail. Oftentimes they know the series better than the creator because they're just that invested. However, it can be pretty dangerous because fans can lack objectivity. They can be more interested in their own pet concepts than what is good for the overall story. All it takes is a look at any forum where fans brag about what they'd do if they were in charge of Dragon Ball and how cringeworthy some of those ideas are to be thankful fans aren't in charge. And while, like I said, I doubt she had much control over what she was told to write, I get the impression she was itching to get the chance to give Bardock really cool stuff to do. Maybe a what-if story really means it's asking what if everything that made the Bardock special good was undone? Now, the Bardock special, in its very conception, teetered on the edge of gratuitous fan service, but in nearly every case it added in an element that mitigated it. The protagonist is Goku's father who confronts Frieza. That's potentially stupid. However, he's a low-class nobody who Frieza flicks away without comment. That works. He gets a special ability to see into the future. Potentially stupid. However, it doesn't save him, nobody knows about it, and all it does is torture him for a few days and contribute to the pathos and feelings of helplessness. That works. He gains an important insight and connection into his good guy son's future. Potentially stupid. However, Bardock himself never changes his own moral alignment, nor does the story ever even hint at something like that. And most importantly, the story is good enough and presents a character with enough depth that the few places it does slip up are easily forgivable. Compare that to Episode of Bardock. Bardock tragically dies? Nope. He not only survives, but is flung back to the past. He's a mass-murdering planet conqueror? Nope. He's a bit grumpy, but he only fights the bad guys. He never attempts to subjugate the tiny pacifists who rescue him. He just glowers at them a bit. A Plantian child follows him around and tries to become his friend. Isn't that cute? It's like Uncle Piccolo with Gohan. He's not so bad. Bardock is beaten by Frieza? Well, technically yes, but just as Bardock is a Goku clone, Chilled is a Frieza clone and serves as a perfect substitute to ensure that, essentially, Bardock does get to beat a version of Frieza. The main misstep the Bardock special made was to make Bardock too strong. And I apparently didn't make that point as clear as I would have liked to last time because, to my great dismay, my comments feed blew up with people talking about the near-death power-up and how the story says that Bardock nearly dies in every mission, so it does make sense that he could become that strong. Whether or not it's possible was never my point. My point was that making Bardock a Saiyan second only to Vegeta was a poor choice for the story. Yes, it does contradict the idea that he's a low-class nobody. Yes, Zarbon and Dodoria's comments about how quickly those nameless Saiyans took over Kanasa opens up the conversation about wiping out Saiyans in general, but that conversation is about how strong Saiyans are when they team up, and how strong Vegeta is in particular. As that conversation demonstrates, Bardock by himself is in no way important enough to be noticed by Frieza or inspire him to kill the Saiyans. He needs to be a cog in the machine and not stand out in any way. And giving him a battle power of 10,000 and having him plow through hundreds of henchmen undermine that principle. However, compare that to Episode of Bardock, where he not only takes out not Frieza, but does so by becoming a Super Saiyan, the most important transformation in the franchise. Not only does he become a Super Saiyan, it's implied he has become the Super Saiyan, the man who inspired the legend of the Super Saiyan in the first place. That's about as far away from the concept of a low-class nobody striving and failing and being forgotten as you can possibly get. If we accept this as having actually happened, Bardock is now one of the most important figures in the Dragon Ball mythos. It's as if Oishi or her bosses, despite claiming to be fans of Bardock, didn't understand him in the slightest. They didn't understand that what makes Bardock special is that he's not special. Because this story is nothing but fan service. A popular character comes back, has all of his dreams and ambitions come true, gets to kick all kinds of ass, and serves as the basis for important lore. How could anyone who enjoyed the Bardock special have wanted something like this to happen to him? This absolutely ruins Bardock. It ruins his story. It ruins everything that made Bardock a compelling character in the first place. It's putting fans' self-gratification of their favorite character over the storytelling. I mean, yeah! Look at that face! Is that a face you expect to see on Bardock? I know this is really a sequel to the Bardock special, and it's only technically a Dragon Ball prequel, but it amazes me how, if you ignore that it is a follow-up to the Bardock special, just how it falls headfirst into all those prequel traps. The Bardock special could so easily have been this story. It could have gone for the cheap thrills and made its protagonist a focus-tested super badass dreamboat. They chose not to. But it almost seems as if those in charge of episode of Bardock saw all those pitfalls they avoided as missed opportunities. So they gleefully dived in every pit, twisted their ankles in every pothole, and bounced down every cliffside, yelling all the way down how cool this was going to be. The whole story is predicated on a ridiculous premise. Why does Bardock travel through time? I didn't realize that exploding caused people to travel through time. Does that mean Kiwi and Dodoria are living it up on planet Namek's past? Not to mention that the Cell arc establishes how time travel works in Dragon Ball. It creates alternate timelines, it doesn't change the past. It doesn't preclude that Vegeta on Namek could be unknowingly talking about Bardock if our timeline is an extension of that bit of time travel. But does that mean there's no Super Saiyan legend in Bardock's original timeline? Well, no, that can't be right, because flippin' Frieza mentions his fear of Super Saiyans just before he hits Bardock with his magic 1.21 gigawatt ball. And that's another thing. I understand that this is one of those conceits that's necessary to remind readers or viewers what's going on, but I hate that this changes Bardock's confrontation with Frieza so that Frieza actually talks to Bardock. No! No! It seems like a tiny thing, and compared to the atrocities committed by the rest of the episode, it really is. But that is not the relationship between Frieza and Bardock. Part of what made the end of the Bardock special work is how unimportant Bardock was to Frieza. Sure, he was annoyed that Bardock smashed through his men, and yes, that was stupid and should never have happened. It would have been better if Bardock had made no impact on Frieza at all. But Frieza wouldn't talk to Bardock, he wouldn't toy with Bardock, he wouldn't explain his plans to Bardock. Bardock is nothing to him, he's not worth talking to, he's not worth acknowledging, he's not Frieza's nemesis, he's just some guy. Frieza ignoring Bardock before flicking his finger at him really drives that insult home. Frieza monologuing to Bardock and worrying about Super Saiyans dilutes the impact of that scene so much. Speaking of inconsistencies, the implication that Bardock is the source of the Super Saiyan legend comes from a dying Chilled telling his men to pass down the warning to watch out for beings called Saiyans whose hair turned gold, and that's the reason why Frieza fears Super Saiyans above all else, or them growing increasingly stronger and ganging together to revolt. The series isn't terribly consistent with that. First off, it always just seemed to make more sense for that to be a legend that the Saiyans passed down that Frieza overheard, not the other way around. After all, why would Frieza tell the Saiyans that? For that matter, why would he employ Saiyans in the first place if he knew about that? Second, since the name Super Saiyan is never uttered by either Bardock or Chilled, obviously, where did the name come from? Because there is the fact that no one in the Frieza arc ever mentions anything about a Super Saiyan having golden hair. Vegeta seems to think that he and Goku are Super Saiyans without any kind of physical transformation taking place. When Goku does become one and his hair does turn gold, Frieza displays no recognition, despite Vegeta constantly blathering on about Super Saiyans right to him. If that's the only characteristic about Super Saiyans that was passed down to Frieza, how would he not know it? So while this is supposed to tie things together, it only takes the elements of the transformation nobody talks about in the legend, and fails to introduce the concepts they do talk about. It's almost like they're two separate concepts introduced 20 years apart from each other. And oh my gosh, I just realized that by covering an episode of Bardock here, this is how I'm introducing Super Saiyan to Dragon Ball Dissection. Oh, jeez, I can't believe it. Just try to forget about episode of Bardock after this review is over. Like I wish I could. This is why I typically do things in order. And by now, I'm sure people who like episode of Bardock, can't understand why you do, but I know a lot of you exist, are angry at me for calling out plot holes here while largely glossing over plot holes in the Bardock special. Well, as I intimated last time, I feel one's tolerance for plot holes is directly proportional to how good they feel the story is and how much damage the plot hole causes. Stuff like a happy baby Goku contradicts things, and that bothers me, but it fits the narrative. I can live with a small discrepancy because the narrative it is supporting is good enough to justify it. Conversely, a plot hole that only exists to hold up a crappy story is doubly insulting, because not only does the story suck, it's contradicting things that are actually good. Obviously, what plot holes are worth it is going to vary from person to person, but this person thinks it's just tedious. Yes, the damage to Bardock as a character is infuriating, but even taken on its own, this is a very pedestrian story. The new characters we are introduced to are not terribly interesting or fleshed out, and Bardock's story is not continued in any substantial way. For example, the budding relationship between Bardock and Barry, pretty much the only new concept the story attempts to develop, is paper thin. We learn nothing about Barry that makes us understand why he cares about Bardock, and they don't interact beyond a few moments of token cuteness. And I completely forgot until I reread this for the review, but Barry getting hurt is what triggers Bardock's Super Saiyan transformation. What? Geez, I guess my brain rewrote the stupid to something slightly more plausible, like Bardock's helplessness at being beaten by a Frieza again. But if the entire transformation, the whole reason this story exists in the first place, is predicated on this relationship, it better be a relationship I believe in. I'm sorry, but Barry bringing Bardock a few baskets of food does not sell me on this connection. And really, Bardock rejects his own newborn son because of his battle power readout, yet he's going to bond with this little ball of useless? How does that in any way fit with his character? And if you're watching the animated version, Barry is completely insufferable. If he yells, "Bardock-san," one more time, I'm going to pick him up by his stupid eye stalks and toss him into a meat grinder. Jeez, I hate this little twerp. I know his name is a reference to berries, the fruit, but I just keep thinking of Barry from American Dad. I will take a break from criticizing the story to credit the art. As I said, I like Oishi's art, even if she is drawing Bardock as the bad boy man of her dreams rather than the cold-blooded killer that he is. But she does make some good aesthetic choices, such as drawing the Bardock special prologue on black paper and introducing new characters' names with text boxes. It honestly made me feel like I was watching an episode of Super Sentai. She also uses much more screen tone, the spread of gray dots used to create shading, than Toriyama ever did in the original series. He hated using screen tone because, you guessed it, it was too much work. So her use of screen tone definitely made her manga stand apart from Toriyama's. Then again, all the screen tone made it much more difficult for me to clean up the manga pages. The anime, on the other hand, doesn't really replicate the unique features of the manga. It has that made of plasticine look that all modern Dragon Ball animation seems to have that I can't stand. However, it does do a cool effect of changing from color to black and white over and over again during the Super Saiyan transformation, which is a pretty interesting idea. And while the television adaptations of the Dragon Ball manga were largely a one-to-one panel-to-screen transference, added material notwithstanding, the animated version of episode of Bardock takes quite a few liberties with the source material. And surprisingly, it actually prunes quite a bit of content from the manga. The first several pages of Chapter 2 are excised entirely. I find that particularly funny considering how that includes a bit where Chilled sticks his hand through the body of one of his minions, which is most likely alluding to a bit where Frieza does the same thing to one of his subordinates. A bit that was exclusive to the TV series. So the manga has a reference to the TV series, but the animated version doesn't. But for the most part, the animated version's cuts help the pacing and make character reveals pack a bit more punch. Then again, it also adds that crap where Barry cries out Bardock's name over and over and over again. Jesus, like frickin' water torture. One interesting change the animated adaptation makes is to reblock the opening scene so that it hews slightly more closely to the Bardock special. While it also cuts out parts where Frieza actually leaves his ship. Geez, these cuts are really making me realize Oishi spends a lot of panel space showing characters going to places. But while both versions have Zarbon and Dodoria present outside the ship while they weren't in the original, and both versions have them and Frieza personally explaining to Bardock why they're killing him, which wasn't in the original, I get the impression Oishi only drew hers on the basis of memory. I mean, in the manga, Frieza's blast doesn't even hit Bardock. Frieza throws it past him. I mean, I suppose she was trying to make it seem more plausible that he would survive, but I mean, why bother at this point? He travels through flippin' time! I think plausibility is already out the window here. The animated version tries to recreate iconic shots from the Bardock special, such as Bardock being engulfed in the blast. Episode of Bardock's only dubious merits are gratuitous fanservice, superficial world building, and the cool factor of bringing back Bardock. The only point of interest is to those who really needed to know where the Super Saiyan came from, and count me as one of those who couldn't have cared less. Legends are almost always more interesting when they're mysterious. Oh, but we find out that the stuff used in the medical machines is the stuff the Plantians used to cure wounds, and Toriyama himself created the design for Chill. That makes everything so worth it! So from a narrative perspective, there is nothing that episode of Bardock does right. It's a textbook example of how not to write a prequel. It's a perfect demonstration as to why tragedy shouldn't have sequels, and the only way it's not a slap in the face to anyone who enjoyed the Bardock special is if you assume that none of this ever happened, and that it's just Bardock hallucinating his wildest fantasies in the instant before he dies. And it's not too hard to assume that's what they were going for. After all, how else would Bardock's clothes be in completely perfect condition upon waking up in the past when they were torn up even before Frieza confronted him? And to be honest, if I do just think of it as a bit of fantasy, I can't really find myself compelled to get too upset by it. It's still a pretty lame story, but not an offensive one. As silly as it sounds, it's only when people try to tell me that Bardock really is the legendary Super Saiyan that I want to choke the story to death with a fishnet stocking. Oh wait, it's only in the animated version where Bardock's armor is torn up like it's supposed to be. Oishi and her manga conveniently ignore that little bit. You know what, screw this story, it sucks. But both of the Bardock stories we've covered so far have come from other sources. Aside from the one brief reference to the Bardock special in the manga, Toriyama Akira had never so much as touched on Bardock in his own story. Well, 3 years after episode of Bardock, that all changed, as the father of Dragon Ball stepped up to once and for all deliver the definitive take on the father of Goku. And so next time, we cover Dragon Ball Minus. And that's terrible.